To this, I think it's the 8th curriculum conversation for the year. The purpose of these conversations is for lecturers, and sometimes there are students in this group, to grapple about what it means, what the whole notion of curriculum transformation means. And over the course of, I don't know, the 6-7 months or so that we've been doing these conversations, we've had a whole range of different meanings, which I'm not going to go into, but I would like to invite you to go and have a look at the Are You Connected site for these curriculum conversations. And there are notes on each of the conversations we've had, outlining what different people have thought about this notion of curriculum transformation. This evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Got Gladman Tontlana from the Environmental Science Department, and later on Rod Amner from Journalism and Media Studies. Before Rod talks, I'll say a bit more about what he's going to do. Gladman is going to talk about group diversity and learning in the Department of Environmental Science, issues and challenges. So he's going to talk for about 20 minutes, after which we can have a discussion, and then Rod will talk for about 20 minutes, after which we can discuss Rod's talk, and then we can talk about both. Okay. So over to you, Gladman.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good. So I'm just going to share my experiences in environmental science as a lecturer, but also as a course coordinator in terms of one approach or method that we use to enable student learning, which is group work. And just to say, well, English is my second language, so if I don't pronounce some words very well, please feel free to just shout. So this presentation will be based on a paper that I worked on with one of the colleagues from Channel, and I've deliberately omitted some stuff or avoided some stuff, but I'm just going to talk about diversity, especially issues of race. So I know sometimes people feel uncomfortable, but I'm just going to do that because one of our reviewers said, I think this issue should be tackled head on. So I'm just going to use black, white. So I hope no offense at all. Okay. It's very difficult as an academic to start getting to group work without talking about the abstract ideas around group work, theoretical foundations, and how it's related to learning. So group work enables learning via interactions, sharing experiences, and collaboration. So this is the rationale behind our use of group work for learning in environmental science. And again, one critical aspect in group work is that diversity matters. So diversity, we're talking about recognizing differences in terms of the ways of being and also ways of knowing, which I think is quite important to have a distinction between those two. So there are various marks of differences if you want to think of diversity in terms of race, in terms of gender, ethnicity, environmental science, subject matters, because we draw our students from different faculties and different disciplines. Personalities, ideologies, etc. And it's important to know that the diversity obviously affects perceptions or influences perceptions, and these perceptions influence interactions among students. But I should say this. So just to give you a background of what environmental science, the environmental science discipline is all about. Okay, so this is relatively new. In fact, our department is one of the newest departments on campus. I think established around 2000. And this kind of emerged our calls to bridge the artificial differences between the social and natural sciences and addressing environmental challenges. I'm sure if you've been discussing with other colleagues, there are guys in the science faculty who don't think that environmental science is a science in a way. There are also guys in humanities who think that we are kind of sitting on the fence, but we actually celebrate because we're kind of unique in that way. So ideally, our approach is that there's no linear or simple cure or an approach to environmental problems. So we draw on the social aspects, science aspects from anthropology, from law, and so on. And imagine these different disciplines might actually come up with a better understanding of environmental challenges. one of the learning outcomes, obviously I think this is quite similar across many disciplines, is the critical analysis is quite important, and obviously consideration of counter viewpoints. So there are some courses, for example, if you get to ecology, environmental science, there are principles for ecology. But if you get to the social sphere, there are many different viewpoints and counter viewpoints, and we try to support students to get in those alien territories, so to speak. So I would say that environmental science, the environmental science discipline renders itself very comfortably into the issues of group work, because we're looking at counter viewpoints, different opinions about a certain environmental challenge, for example. So at second year level, just to say, we don't have first years in environmental science, so we shop our students from different disciplines, different subjects. So we start at second year and third year. So at second year, there's a practical project. Students get out in the field, collect data, analyze data, and write reports together. And the composition of the groups is quite diverse, by ethnicity, by race, subject majors, and so forth. And at third year level, we also have group work on research projects. So students come up, or staff members come with a project, students choose, and they work on a research project as a group from the first term to the last term, or the fourth term rather. So, in other words, I would say group work is not conceptualized well to actually make or break the learning experiences of students, because they have to spend the whole year together and work together. And in terms of the weighting of marks, it's quite substantial. Almost 30% of the final mark is from group-based activities. So it's quite critical in this regard. So what I did as part of my PG dip, I just looked at experiences of students in second year and third year in the past 2 years. So just to inform our understanding of the experiences of group work and what we actually conceptualize group work to achieve, theoretically. So I thought it was kind of eye-opener for me as a kind of young and new lecturer at Rhodes University, just to inform my understanding of these different approaches or methods for learning. So I'm not going to get into the methods that we use, obviously we use the questionnaire and so forth, but I'm just going to share with you some of the experiences of students regarding group work, and perhaps it can provoke you to just start thinking about what this means. Okay, so we just looked at decision making, for example, because students have to make decisions regarding who does what, when, and so forth. So from this study, based on the second years and third years, about 40% of the students, obviously these students have left Rhodes, because 2 years ago, they said they reached decisions through consensus. 27% said voting, and 33% they said one person made the decision in those groups. So we could say there's some elements of democracy. There's a democratic process in terms of making decisions, but again, there are also elements of domination that are quite key in these groups. So one thing that I'm thinking about is that, okay, so perhaps students will find it difficult to make their voice heard, could feel isolated, so unwittingly. And the question that I have, I may not have an answer for that, but then how do we make the quieter students engaged? I'm just going to link this with issues of language, issues of ethnicity, and so forth later on. This is very much descriptive. So students' feelings, contributions not taken seriously, that's what other students say, but across the racial divide. Personality clashes, cooperation not entirely necessary to complete given tasks. These are some of the perceptions and feelings of students. There's a quote here, I dislike that I always have to work hard in group work when other members do not pull their weight. So again, there are also kind of different targets when it comes to the final grade. Some students say 50% is enough for me, so they only do enough to get 50. Others are high achievers, they want maybe 75. So already those differences could actually create some conflictual relationships in group work and actually jeopardize the learning that happens in groups. So obviously we have to agree that there are different approaches to learning. Okay, some students say they could be surface learners, they just remember what you teach. They can read from the lecture slides. Others trying to make meaning out of what is taught and apply in different contexts for deeper approaches to learning. And in terms of the deeper approach to learning, about 50% reported that they actually employ this approach when they are learning environmental science. And also something positive about group work from the student experiences. They say, okay, with different backgrounds, different well-rounded perspectives are incorporated into the project, which is one of the key aspects underlying group work as a learning approach or method. The other one said, my group was not very cohesive, but gave me insights on how to deal with problematic personalities in the future. Group dynamics are essential and inevitable in life, because we know that when we employ in group work, we know students could learn lessons that are useful beyond Rhodes University or higher education institutions. That's one of the main reasons which we employ group work. But then I kind of focused down to issues of race. It with respect to some groups who highlighted some challenges within their groups. So a couple of students were not really happy with the way the group dynamics and so forth. So a bit of discontent with group work. So sometimes you do learn from people who are different from you in terms of ethnic background, but some people do not even consider your opinions because they generalize due to your background. My friends and I have experienced this. One of the students again said, I think being from different ethnic backgrounds played a huge role, as one was judged even before they could present their ideas to the group. So again, I'm not an expert in this area, and I don't want to confirm this, but I just want to say these are perceptions, and obviously perceptions have influences on how, on interaction within groups. So whether it's perceived or it's real, this is another debate, but this is important. It's important to know that, obviously, this discourse of transformation at Rhodes, the student body is increasingly getting diversified. And there is enough evidence from the literature that shows that students who have been, or social groups rather, who have been previously disadvantaged or discriminated against, often carry these stereotypes associated with their groups into different situations. So this could have been something at play here, because obviously we're coming from different backgrounds, and some students, before even they get into group work, they actually think that their values won't be considered as useful. And the question is, how then, as a lecturer, do you relate to that? How do you overcome that? How do you support those students to get engaged? Obviously, if we're talking of equitable access to education and success, it's a big issue. Because we found in science faculty, the dropout rate for black students and pass rate is very low. The dropout rate is very high, pass rate is very low. And got me thinking, what could be behind this? Maybe we could do something more. So what we do in group-based tasks, we also have what we call peer review assessment. So there's so many reasons we do peer review, obviously to teach students how to actually do peer assessment of their own colleagues, but also to actually encourage them to learn, because it can provide social pressure to avoid things like social loafing within groups. So again, I just extracted a few cores that I think are relevant for my presentation today, but I'm not saying the whole research was characterized by these. Okay. PAs can be useful for learning, but are rarely impartial and are usually motivated by factors other than the task at hand. This was a black student. I often think I deserve more, and I get really upset when I see a low mark. Also, people who do not do as much work get higher marks because they're friends in the group. Again, from a black student. So, as I said, I've been working with students in the past 3 years as a course coordinator. So, very recently, I received an email from one of my students, a black student. And she just told me this message and said, I thought it would be only fair to update you about what is going on at this point. It is towards the end of the year, which should be a great thing, but I have been exhausted in the past weeks and feeling like getting up. I guess I've had the worst experience with my group, and I have not spoken about what happened, but it has been eating me up. I'm picking myself up, but it is a process. I'm looking forward to the end of group work and fully focus on my exams. I just thought that you should know as a supervisor. I thought there was a lot at stake in it. So for me, the idea is not really to name and blame in this context. I think group work yields positive learning outcomes, but I think perhaps maybe some oversight in terms of what we expect from group work, from the learning experiences as a result of group work. And I thought maybe it could provide an opportunity for us to start thinking about making groups or departments or different spaces at Rhodes more kind of hospitable in a sense, because maybe we are overlooking some of these issues. So, in terms of the key lessons from some of these presentations, from these comments, I think the group work to a large extent in environmental science, it yields the learning outcomes. There are positive learning experiences across ethnic backgrounds, across racial backgrounds, across the various disciplinary backgrounds. And then these positive learning experiences kind of challenges me as a lecturer or educators in terms of assumptions that racial issues of considerable concern. So to some extent, I'm a bit more comfortable because when you get in the classroom situation, you also carry these stereotypes from experiences and so forth. But I think these assumptions have been proven wrong to some extent. Students are basically comfortable working with each other. There are few who might find these issues of group work disturbing. But we don't want to overshadow or overlook the issues of othering. It could be one student, it could be two, but I don't think the issues of race and learning should be, kind of understood in just numbers, because numbers are meaningless. I think one person out of a million is too important to actually understand that. So, again, I'm not quite sure, because obviously I'm not part of the groups and I don't know what happens behind the scenes. So I would say maybe this othering could be real or perceived. But again, the bottom line is that whether real or perceived, this could constrain the learning experiences of students across the region. So what we're thinking about at the moment is just reconsidering how, especially the issue of language and group work interplays. Because we've found that some students whose language is not, the first language is not English, find it very difficult to actually participate in a way that's expected from other students. So it could be one thing that we could look at. But one question that I have is, whose role is that? Obviously academics, most of us are busy, and we're supposed to make sure we support these students to get to the level that their peers actually expect them to be. As I say, some of these questions I don't think I've got the answers for. So some of the key questions in environmental science going forward is that, so in what ways can group work or departments create learning rather than alienating spaces? Because for some students, these small groups, departments with alienating spaces, and I think there's need to think about ways of making sure it becomes, a learning space. And another question, is this relevant for the broader debate about curriculum transformation in Rhodes? Maybe yes, I'm not quite sure, but there are different groups, whether it's in the classroom or maybe meetings or whatever. So I think this is quite important to think about it. And then how do we deal with issues of diversity, in particular race and language? Again, I've got this question. I'm not an expert in issues of race and so forth. And if a student comes to me and says, well, I think there's kind of racial profiling in the group, how do I respond to that without blowing things out of proportion? And also, as a black coordinator, if a black student comes to me with these issues, how do I respond to that without being partial in the eyes of other students? So I think these are some of the challenges that students face, but also as an academic I face. And the other thing is, we talk about group work, it's very good, it could yield positive learning outcomes, but I don't think we've done enough in terms of understanding how this could be reflected in our assessment. So if we know that student X, Y, and Z have problems in the language, how do we reflect that in assessment? Because at the end of the day, they assess by their peers, and we don't know what's happening behind the scene. And if there's a task, group-based task, how do I factor the issue of language in my assessment? Because oftentimes we say, wow, this doesn't make sense. There's no logical flow of ideas. Major points have not been highlighted in a coherent fashion. But obviously it could be the issue of language. Then how do I factor that in? So the assessment space is quite problematic at the moment. So I guess, so these are some of the things that we're doing in our department, and I'm so passionate about group work, and I'm really keen to see students working together. But again, we cannot ignore some of these challenges that perhaps some of them are beyond our control, but how do we deal with them in a way that makes learning something that's enjoyable for students from different backgrounds? Thank you.
Lecturers who are in that kind of position have this policy where students have to, at the end of the assessment or the end of the exercise, they have to identify which student they feel contributed how much. So is it 30-30-30 or 60-40, zero or whatever the case may be. Do you think this is how would you feel about a system like that? Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's a good thing to do or
Can you
not?
say that again? Sorry.
So, for instance, at the end of the assessment,
Yes.
every student has got to privately send to you their assessment as to how much work they think that all the other programs have put in as a percentage.
Right.
How do you feel about something like that? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's control?
To be honest with you, I've got mixed feelings about it.
Yeah.
On the one hand, that's fine because you're giving students a chance to actually, do a peer review their colleagues. But well, we're not there when they do discussions and so forth. And sometimes one of the problems that we face is that students' contribution is based on just attendance. So we've got 5 things. So in terms of attendance, it's 5 over 5. In terms of academic contribution, in terms of usefulness of ideas and so forth. But if a student doesn't pitch up for a meeting, for example, then they get low marks for everything. So there's conflation of attendance and talking with contribution to academics. So it's a bit problematic for me. But we're doing that, we're employing that. But again, that's when you find some black students feeling that, well, the marks are low, not merely because they did not contribute, but because of their color. And how to deal with that? It's very difficult for me to say, well, I'm just going to give you more marks because I wasn't there when they did the discussion. So this
my fear with student-based peer reviewing is that it tends to ignore or rather disregard the structural challenges that we're facing in the country, specifically the transition from basic education to higher education, because that does not account for the experiences of first-generation black working class students, for example, who could even be the first in their family to come to university. So for the whole idea that then we as a group will therefore peer review each other does not account for why Mulamuli is quiet and Jeanette or other people are much more active and proactive in the group. So I don't think students have got that cognitive discipline to be able to recognize and identify those other structural issues that are more than just a personal choice that I don't like talking and therefore I will lose like 20% or 15% no matter how you grade it. So that's normally my fear when it's student-based peer reviewing. It tends to ignore those kind of structural issues that are quite real, like you mentioned.
Actually, I agree. Totally. And I mean, the process was very much subjective. Because what's the academic contribution to 5 people who are from different backgrounds who understand things differently, but then being marked the same kind of wavelength in a sense. So again, creates problems. But I guess the whole issue of assessment is problematic. Even we could have 5 different lecturers marking the same piece of work, allocating different marks. It's possible. So it's both ways,
Then Mandy.
Gladman, I'm wondering whether, having done this piece of research, whether you would be up to having what is sometimes called courageous conversations with future classes, where you say things like, these are the sorts of things that have come up in the past, and as your reviewer said, you face the racial stuff head on, and you talk about the difference between first generation students, you talk about the issues of language, and you kind of, make visible those normally just ignored issues and discuss it with your students before they do the group work. And it's quite a brave thing to do, and one would have to do it extremely sensitively. But I'm just wondering if then this research would have been really useful because it will inform your pedagogy. In the future. That's just a suggestion.
In previous years we've invited Mandy, so I'm sure it's something that she would be willing to do next year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, then.
I volunteer, man.
That's a really important, sorry, Mandy, just before you talk, a really important point about group work, that it's not just about what students learn about the subject matter, it's also about what they learn about group processes. And so if in this country race, is and diversity and language, if those are issues, then we do need to find the spaces to address them. But I think Lynn is right to say that it's about having it's not an easy conversation. It's what people term courageous conversation. So how do we have that? How do we have those kinds of conversations? And I think maybe we need a lot more preparation as lecturers to be able to to do that.
Yeah, one point we make out of this research is that obviously there are some students who felt that they would do more in a homogeneous group, but we kind of counter that and say, well, having different views maybe would make other students become more explicit about their ideas in a way. I know it's challenging, but it's important, you know.
And it's kind of into Lynn's point, because up until now, the focus has been, and Edmund talked about how they harvest from other departments. So one of the first things is that students in second year don't actually realize what it's like, how a commerce student, how their own perception of how a commerce student thinks, or what they expect from a science student, or what they expect from a humanities. So I guess with this piece of research, that kind of workshop that we normally do with your second and third years can now also incorporate what's come out from your, so it's the next layer that we need to come out into that.
I think I was going to say something fairly similar, because I'm thinking, you know, if you're involving students in group work, one would think then that guidance around that group work would actually be an important part of the process. So as you say, it's not just the learning of environmental things. And you know, how does one structure that into things? So, I mean, I don't know what size or classes. What size are the groups, by the way?
5, 6, depending on the number of students every year. But they vary from 5 to 6 or maybe 7 at most.
Because you know, I think the bigger the group, the more complex it gets.
Correct.
So you know, one wonders if you know, I've often wondered if something like pair work or even 3 maximum doesn't kind of take away some of that tension. So you can, you know, because the moment you've got 4 or 5, then people start dominating. But if there's at least 2 or 3 of you perhaps, and then also, you know, so I think that maybe thinking about the group size, thinking about the fact that it's such high stakes. I think a lot of the tension is coming from the high stakes nature of that assessment. But then, you know, I think that the guidance part, the pedagogic process that's taking place in that group work must be such a key part of environmental science. You know, how do you make decisions in a group? How do you know, what is that decision-making process? And is it a negotiated process? So it's not just negotiated amongst themselves around, you know, whether we should do this in the assessment, but it's actually around the environmental decisions. You know, it's kind of a. So I think there's a double process almost going on there that I think would need some intervention or guidance or something, and I don't know what it is. But,
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point.
Kind of a general comment, but I think builds on some previous ones, that the idea that your research now can go back and inform pedagogy, I think it also informs the bigger space, which you alluded to in one of your bullets, because the conversations around which students get to talk in group work and whose voices are heard and whose knowledge is more valued also leads us as academics to start questioning amongst us whose voices are heard in meetings, who has the right to speak amongst academics, and so, you know, there's just a synergy, I think, in what you are looking at in your classroom and what we as the academy need to be looking at.
I agree. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, something that relates to something that Rod does is that sometimes it's useful to have a task and then a reflective task. And as perhaps a group where the task has gone awry, but the reflection on what happened, and you know, so you may have someone who the group work has been a bit disastrous, but they're able to write quite clearly around what the problems were, how they felt, the dynamics, and perhaps a little space for that may actually help to even things out. Because I think that there have been times, you know, when students, I mean, that comes up quite a bit in your class, where students do something and part of the work is doing and part of the work is reflecting. And that reflective space can, sometimes especially when it's going on, can give people space to kind of talk through some.
Another challenge that I faced was when to do that reflective task, because maybe they might be perceived as being, you know, you want to name and shame and so forth. So we thought perhaps maybe doing that at the end of the group, again, it's too late, but maybe that could inform the next generation, you know, whatever, in the next following year. But then it will be late again, because people have lost the marks over the whole year and they'll be affected.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a whole year, then you don't get it at the end. Do you want to?
The question is, how do you do it without creating those tensions again? Because then, if you do it media, for example, they still have to work together for deliverables. And if you created something on a big thing in the group already, so it's kind of breaking waters.
Well, I wouldn't expect the reflection to be seen by the students. I'd expect the reflection only to be seen by the people marking the lecture or the tutors if there are tutors, because and some students won't reflect. So they know that one person has been absolutely awful and they will not put that down on paper. But so there may be ways of structuring that in a way that perhaps they're just reflecting on their own contributions and their own. But I mean that may give space for students. I've had students say to me, I have withdrawn. I'm not working properly, but it's happening because I don't feel like I'm respected. I tried to give ideas, people rejected them. No one wants to, so the other people think they're not working, but they're able to explain why they're not working. And it's to do with how they've been kind of treated perhaps by
Ron and then David.
I was very interested in the stats you gave for the ways to resolve things and to make decisions in the group, because you almost had a perfect model there. I was actually quite gratified to see 40% went for consensus, which was quite nice. Well, that's an interesting one. And then there was... there were authoritarians, and then there were the sort of liberal proceduralists. So you could almost sort of see models of democracy being. I was particularly interested in the deliberative democracy people who were into the sort of consensus, civic republicanism, all of that. Isn't that something that you could almost encourage them to reach for? Is sort of say, actually, this is what tends to happen. So similar kind of thing about modeling and training. But we want you to reach for consensus. So, and then maybe model. It's actually possible to train people in the techniques of deliberative democracy, actually, within a group.
I haven't thought about it, but I think it's a good point, actually, to be honest.
That point fits really well to what Karen was saying.
Yeah.
About
the thinking before actually implemented.
Yes. David?
I just wanted to ask a sort of mundane question. Do the marks, does each person in the group get assessed on something they produce themselves, or is there a mark assigned that everyone in the group gets?
So there is a mark assigned that everyone gets in the group, but then they did the peer review. So based on the peer review, you could get the maximum, like you got 80, or you can actually get 60.
Okay, that I don't understand. So they get a mark and then peer review. Okay, what is a peer review and how does that fit into the mark?
So pretty much what happens is they submit a deliverable, a lecturer marks, and assign a mark, right? So the group gets 80%.
Right.
And then the students have to do a peer review amongst themselves in that group, say, in terms of attendance, in terms of punctuality, in terms of academic.
And that's taken into account? And you take that into account?
Yes, we do. Yeah, and that can actually substantially affect the final mark that the student gets.
Okay. I hate group work. I find the major problem is just interacting with another human being. It's impossible. I find there's always either there's someone, and I'm thinking back to when I was a student. Either I had paired up with someone I couldn't communicate with, or I thought they were so stupid I couldn't bear them, And it was just an absolute nightmare. And I'm sort of aware of that when I see my second year practical and second year physics students in their cracks when they do the practice groups.
Yeah.
And I'm aware that sometimes the dynamic isn't easy, but I don't really know how to change it. I sort of let them sort it out. I give them a choice of when they write a lab report. I say that I would recommend they write their own lab report. I say that's what I would do because I would never trust anyone. But they sometimes choose to submit a group lab report, and then I accept that if that's what they want. But I certainly I wouldn't do this, but you can do it.
So do you think just providing maybe two choices, group-based or individual?
Yeah, I sort of tell them what to do initially, and when they push the boundary, I give them a choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was not very mundane, David. Okay. I think we're going to stop this conversation here so that Ron can have a chance, and then if people have more to say after you've thought of it more.
All right. yeah, it really is a pity that, of course, he couldn't be here, because she has substantially written a paper connected to this idea of displacement and emplacement. There's a sort of a NRF funded research project, Pedagogy of Place, which is a joint effort between the Department of Politics and Journalism, that has gotten off the ground this year. There are a number of dimensions to it, and I'll try and touch on a couple of them, but the one that I'm particularly going to focus in on is the first year course that I ran in the first half of the year. And of course he sat in on it and sort of observed and took some notes and met some students about it. So we're going to present some of the feedback on that to you. Really, the premise is kind of, the difficulty of educating student journalists in a strange place. I'm to try and sort of elaborate on that a little bit. Most of our students are not from Grahamstown, and that's the case for most faculty, but for journalism that's kind of a problem, because if you're trying to teach students to represent a place and the people in it and the process and institutions in the place, that's quite a disadvantage, actually. I know a student, for example, went to grew up outside Grahamstown all his life, read Grocot's Mail of all things all his life, went to Stellenbosch, didn't read the local newspaper there for 4 or 5 years, came back here, still reads the Grocot, so never felt at home in Stellenbosch, actually felt at home here. My students are the opposite. They might read their local paper back home, and they come here, they really don't want to read Grocot's Mail. We try and force them, and we give them, force them to take a subscription, but they really resent it. They hate it. I mean, there's some people in the room who can attest that. Do you get charged for Grocot as a master's student?
I'm not sure, but I know there was a big hoo-ha around it.
If you knew you were being charged for it, I'm sure you would feel aggrieved.
Yeah, I would want to make that.
So it's a very diverse class. We ran a survey inside the school, which was part of a national survey, actually, a Sandpad survey, showing that 70% of young people in South Africa are generally uninterested and mistrustful of political institutions and political parties. So we're dealing with that as well. And again, for journalism, the idea of public life, that's a bit of a challenge. So there's low levels of trust in the three tiers of government, the legal system, the police, and the parliament. The other thing that I think is quite alarming is that, we tend to forget just how elite our cohort of students are in the South African context. Out of a grade 1 cohort entering the system in grade 1, I think something like 0.7% get to the end of their first degree, which is a staggering statistic. And the question I'm kind of asking is, well, given the inequality in our society and the diversity and so on, it's kind of difficult for this 0.7% to imagine themselves immersing with the other 99.3% of the population and representing that diversity. And certainly for a lot of our students, they feel a certain level of discomfort in doing that. Can our students occupy the same geographical spaces as the people they're supposed to be reporting on? A lot of my students are very uncomfortable actually going into certain spaces in Grahamstown. Even if they have cars, they don't particularly want to go to certain places. I have to literally be there with them in order for that to happen. And they certainly don't necessarily occupy the same social, moral, linguistic space as the people they represent. As I said, many don't want to read Grocot's Mail. Many don't want to work on Grocot's Mail. We own Grocot's Mail and we push our students through those newsrooms, but it isn't always a positive experience for our students. Recently, I felt rather alarmed by the fact that my students that they don't like Grahamstown. They like Rhodes. They really don't care for this town very much, which is an alarming. It is alarming for me because the idea is that they should immerse in the city and report on it. And in fact, very few of our final year students even want to be journalists. So 1 out of 11 recently said that they were interested in being journalists in my writing and editing class, which is also pretty staggering. So I think I'm up against it. Please, a bit of sympathy and empathy for my position here. The other point as well is that there's an enormous investment in an education. So the idea of doing sort of hyper-local journalism, community journalism, if you like, which is what we encourage our students to do while they're here. It's not a great return on investment. No one is going to go and work for a community media organization because they'll be paid peanuts. So they're reaching for something else, usually in New York or somewhere else. I may be overstating this, but these are things that have come out of the mouths of my students this year, so I'm mentioning them. And the other point is, to what extent are our students living in the public realm at all? I mean, I speak for myself, My son went to St Andrews for a while. I'm on roommate. I have my own private car. I rely on high-tech, not SAPs. I even buy my own drinking water. There's a very long list of things. I've really bought out of the idea of the public services, and being, to what extent am I in a public sphere? Am I similar to someone who's relying on Nsika High School, Settlers Hospital, taxis, SAPS, tap water, 100 meters from their home, etc., etc.? To what extent are we even in the same country? Do we live in the same, social, moral space and geographical space? So what is publicness? We have very differentiated citizenship in our country. Do students occupy these same places? Do they stay even within the class? Do they occupy the same spaces as each other within the class and as their audiences? And the answer very often is actually not really. So we're exploring this concept of a critical pedagogy of place as a means to sort of confront some of these issues and problems, if you like. So of course you would have spoken a little bit about this. I'm going to go through these slides quite fast because I think probably you don't have a lot of time to dwell on them. But it's really in a response to the idea of rejecting the idea of a decontextualized education, isolated from the immediate context of community life. So it stresses individual learning, and the mainstream education stresses individual learning and competition for place in the global economy. And we're trying to, in a sense, I suppose, disrupt that notion and try and build some concept of publicness. So these are the kinds of questions that we're asking. And this really speaks in a way to our mission statement as a school. These are the kinds of questions that I suppose we ask in our own vision and mission. So there's this notion of place-based education. David Grunewald writes, places are profoundly pedagogical as centers of experience. Place provides a lens through which people begin to make sense of themselves and their surroundings. The kind of teaching and shaping that places accomplish depends on the kind of attention that we give them and how we respond to them. The neglect of place in education distracts both teachers and students' attention from, sorry, there should be an apostrophe there, and distorts their response to the actual context of their own lives. Okay, so it's sort of moving away from this uniform and standardized curriculum to one that is focused on the unique strengths, histories, and characteristics of local places. Embraces the experience of being human in connection with others in a particular locale, which has particular historical, geographical, social, cultural, economic, biological, etc. characteristics. And then I think more, this would be, I suppose, more ubiquitous in our university, the concept of critical pedagogy. Quite like the idea, though, of Fred, how do you pronounce Macedo? I'm not sure. Reading the world in order to read the word. Understanding the worldly context in which one experiences the academic, theoretical world. And the other point for me about journalism is that we're not just, obviously, looking at theoretical text to understand media studies and the place of media and social world, social political world, but we're also reading the world in order to read the word, but also then to construct media representation, to actually create words that then represent that world back to publics. So the idea, though, is that we should first read the world. So let's be in the world in order to read it, in order that we can confront, read those words, understand them in a different way, and then also begin to create our own words, well, I suppose in a sense, our own worlds as well. So the idea of re-inhabitation and decolonization come up. Identifying, recovering, and creating material spaces and places that teach us how to live well in our environment. Learning to live in a place could mean pursuing the kind of social action that improves the social and ecological lives of the place people inhabit. So, decolonization involves learning to recognize disruption and injury and to address their cause, to confront a dominant system of thought in order to be able to craft just and sustainable ways of being in the world. Okay, so, sorry, just as a kind of deep background to, I guess, what we were trying to experiment with in this particular course. We were trying to integrate this concept of place into an introductory course in journalism in the first semester of first year. Students were immersed in places quite safely on campus, though, although they were sort of all over this campus through various tasks. So we were attempting to connect learning to the local social, ecological, cultural, and historical context of this university. So we did things like asking them to write autobiographically at the beginning, where did you pack your suitcase before arriving here? The idea was to sort of get a grip on the kind of diversity of the class, although we probably didn't do enough to reflect back to the class and diversity. That happened in the tutorials to some extent, but not so much in the broader class. They did profile research and writing. They wrote profiles on each other, again, to try and access the diversity in the class. So that was about reading diversity. They then did some civic mapping. So they were using a set of tools and techniques designed to help journalists better understand the complex layers of civic life on campus and the relationship between those layers. So this really comes from a sort of a reformist approach to journalism called public journalism, which has its roots in kind of Chicago schools of sociology. And students were asked to, well, I told them that this was an alternative, which was probably a mistake, because they saw it as some sort of weird, newfangled thing that, you know, wasn't real journalism. But the idea was the civic mapping was designed by public journalists as a reform strategy to narrow the gap between news organizations and their audiences and between citizens and access to political influence. And obviously we were interested in it as a teaching tool, which would provide students with a more acute sense of what it might mean to be richly located in this context. So, you know, there's the idea, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the idea of these different layers of civic life and identifying them, boring down into the lower layers, especially into third places and incidental places, to access different kinds of sources, access different kinds of conversations. So we are familiar with these sort of official and quasi-official layers. This is less well known. So this is the third place, not home, not work, but the third place where we come together, sometimes called the great good places. This is a sociologist, again, American sociologist. There's some sort of examples, if you like, of those great good places. Convivial spaces where people talk about things that are dear to them. Often common local problems, you know, might be discussed at such places. And journalists seldom access these places because we are oriented towards the official layer, to some extent to private citizens with the vox pop, but those layers in between we're particularly bad at reaching. So there's sort of incidental spaces, is where we get our water. In Grahamstown we have conversations in those lines, and obviously there's the private layer. And then the idea is that you have different kinds of sources and civic leaders in those different layers. And very often we get, again, the top three, but 4 down to 5. Connectors, capitalists, people that tap into the local grapevine, have news or a strong understand news, local news, strong sense of local history. They're go-to people who get things done, energize others, and so on. Okay, so, and again it's responding to sort of disconnects. Disconnects in South African society around social capital, bonding social capital within social groups, between different social groups, and also linking social capital between citizens and centers of social power, like the state, market, and other sources of power. So again, it's theoretically grounded. So what we did was, in addition to getting our students to go out and access third places, we exploded, yes. Well, we explored, a few explosions, yeah. We explored Rhodes history. We invited, you know, Professor Malam to talk about the history of Rhodes University, and indeed of the man himself. We invited people like Mamuli, PhD students, master students doing research into transformation issues at Rhodes. I think incredibly engaging research that engaged the students in the room in a way that I certainly couldn't as a lecturer. So they had to work hard when they went out into third places to observe and understand the norms of those spaces before easing their way into community conversations. They were doing sort of non-journalism, not putting their microphones, not thrusting those microphones into people's faces, but doing something a little different, a little gentler, trying to tap into the thinking of a diversity of people in the university by listening for how they describe their personal concerns and the so-called big issues. And obviously this happened at a time where Rhodes Must Fall, Rhodes So White was huge. And they discovered that the debates about transformation at Rhodes overwhelmingly dominated third place discussions, where they were able to identify these third places. So we all agreed that that's what they should write about, because that's what they discovered were the issues. They were also told to identify civic leaders in those different days, and they did profiles on those civic leaders, and they then did feature articles based on all of this research. So that was the second phase of the course, to produce journalism that attempted to integrate citizen concerns and viewpoints into the construction and reporting of stories. So the whole idea was that they were supposed to generate debate and structured discussion of public issues through their journalism, and indeed gave them extra credit if they got their journalism published, and some of their journalism was published in, well, Zambia and other countries, but also in the student press, in student blogs run by senior journalism students, and in the local press, and further abroad, actually, as I said, Zambia. Okay, so in a sense, this is a big claim to make, but the idea was that we were provoking confrontations with the dominant system of thought in the hopes that students would learn to recognize disruption and injury in their local places and identify ways to address that. And look, to be honest, I don't think we came anywhere close to doing that, but I think this was the beginning of a pedagogy that was attempting to unearth this and to aim for this, stretch for it, if you like. So this is the methodology that we used, class observations, focus groups, we transcribed the interviews and coded them, and here are a couple of the things that came out. So here you get the sort of pedagogy of discomfort, if you like, or displacement, and then possibly emplacement later on in the course. It was actually a daunting experience because I had to step out of my comfort zone and invade like people's personal space, and I wasn't prepared to do something like that. Didn't really want to do civic mapping. I felt for me it was uncomfortable. It definitely put me out here. This is all about comfort zones and moving out. And this is just campus we're talking about here. Wasn't what I expected, because I expected being taught how to deliver the news like they do in Zero, how to sit on the chair. Yeah, well, myself, so yeah, that would be a trend. It's interesting, there was another quote where someone said, I really don't like Rhodes lectures. What I want are tips, tricks, and shortcuts. Verbatim quote. It's not like in other subjects that once you nail a term or structure, how to write an essay, then you're good to go. You're always learning something new every day, using a different approach every time. First I thought, what am I doing here? What is this guy trying to do? But later I realized, well, with journalism, it's not about remembering every single little thing. It's actually about going out there and doing it. It's not like in maths or something where you learn a new formula. You have to use knowledge that you've learned before now. So I think that's what people don't understand. A lot of them are saying, you're not teaching me anything. Come to a lecture, we're having these discussions. But, where's the stuff I can give you in an exam? I said, well, there's no exam. So, too bad. There obviously was a reflexive essay at the end of the course, which did count for quite a bit. So in a sense, that was constructed in lieu of an exam. Some people were then, though, quite positive about civic mapping. So they kind of got it, eventually. I enjoyed talking to people at these different layers of civic life. I think it's very easy just to think of journalism probably going to interview people, writing a blog, and trying to write something which you can Google. But when we were introduced to civic mapping, it made me realize that there's so much more that is happening, so much more that you would not necessarily be exposed to in any other way, but going out there and talking to people, which seemed like a fairly obvious thing to do. But if you think about how many students' press articles are written at a computer, basically pulling stuff from the internet and constructing it out of your head, with a bit of plagiarism online, and that, these days counts for journalism. In the journalistic world as well, not just amongst journalists. I feel like what we're doing is actual work. Like it's not real academic work, it's just like an opinion or something. They're saying that they're doing primary empirical research. They kind of seeing the value of that, which again is quite gratifying. Feel like you're doing something important. Like the way I've been talking to people who are saying things like, I really struggle at Rhodes, I've had a bad time, I feel alienated, I can't speak this language properly, I feel disadvantaged, and there should be transformation. These are really important things, and to feel like you're contributing to that, it's really validating. What was school even? It's like you're playing games. The course allows you to do things that make you feel valuable. So knowledge of place. If we were not forced to go into the town and actually speak to people around campus, Grahamstown will just be Grahamstown and Rhodes will be Rhodes. I feel like I see Rhodes from a different place than most people because I've been forced to go out and speak to people and take pictures of the place. I've actually come to like this place a lot more. I also thought that for me, And then just to sort of, if we have time, quickly mention how we're trying to do similar things in 3rd and 4th year. So the 3rd and 4th year writing and editing students are running their own blogs. Some of them are public life blogs, there's an education blog, there's a health blog. They partnered with Upstart, which is a media literacy project based at the Georgia Youth Hub. One of the things we did was this is Upstart, was transect walks. This is the Emzweni blog, those are the Emzwenis. That's the Tonic Health blog, just as examples. Obviously, we've been talking about mapping quite a lot. We're talking about place, so we're talking about mapping. We suddenly realized that a whole bunch of people on this campus doing incredibly interesting work in social geography, in anthropology, environmental science, all sorts of other places that really do this kind of mapping work. So that's getting really exciting for us as journalists. So place is starting to open up new methodologies, new ways of seeing, new theoretical perspectives. It's one of my 3rd year writing students talking to the Upstarters before their transect walk. So the idea was to simply film learners, these 15-year-olds, these are grade 9 learners, some in grade 10, walking through their own communities and interpreting their communities as they walked. And they were incredibly articulate and some say verbose. They went on for like an hour and a half. And they were recorded on camera. They then were given access to those recordings at the Georgia Youth Hub. They watched them and then wrote some columns for Grocott's, actually, for the Enviro News column in Grocott's Now. So they were interpreting their sort of environment, their neighborhoods as they went. This guy is a karate expert. This is where he does karate lessons because he can't get into the actual hall, so he's forced to work in this area where, as you can see, there are bullet holes in the glass and there's no actual power, and etc., etc. He told us, and we were very impressed, he said, I've read all these also books in my local library. So we said, well, you've got to go and show us this. So he took us to the local library, and that's the reason he's read all the Isicosa books in the local library, because that's the entire collection. He then told us that his entire life sciences class in grade 10 normal level had failed life sciences in June. And he told me that the reason for this primarily was that there were no textbooks. And he also said that there were no EdSkits or sort of study guides for any subjects in any of the grades, in any of the township high schools. I then went to the local libraries and discovered that the study guides there are 12 years old and they don't support CAPS. So what we, simply by walking with these kids one afternoon, we discovered major public stories that, by the way, really need to be resolved in this town. This girl took us to the lake in her area, told us about the mermaid who mythically lives there, probably claims the lives of some kids in some summers. Their dad checks on the lake, it sort of really is a very beautiful space, actually. But she also told us about this area that had been, about 3 or 4 years ago, Makana Parks and Recreation had transformed it into a really nice space. There were roofs, there were braai areas, there was a netball court, etc. It's all been stripped away. So the idea of having a public resource in this community where, in fact, as Charlie Shackleton and others have pointed out, these people living around the lake were never consulted, never got a sense of ownership over any of this stuff, which is what we discussed in the story that subsequently got written about this. So again, stumbling on major public, local common problems, public issues, simply by walking around with kids, then putting it up, in Grocott's, on wall newspapers, on the blogs, maybe using things like MobiSam and science, trying to cultivate a kind of participatory local media ecology, trying to give people a sense that this is their place and that there's agency and stuff we can do about some of these things as we go. In the past, third years who've spent more immersive time in these kinds of spaces have, I think, again, reported, these are some, I won't read through this, I've run out of time, have reported that it has changed their consciousness, in a sense, of themselves, their identity as citizens, as students, as journalists. The idea of a critical pedagogy of place, contextual knowledge and understanding, critical inquiry, reflection, grounded in our realities, challenging dominant systems of thought, helping to develop identity, commitment, and to some extent community through the public sphere in our case. and trying to integrate those individual, these individual aspirations to New York with sort of some more collective interests. And there are a whole bunch of other ideas which we're wanting to explore, which I don't think I've got time to go into.
Do you want to come and
Yes,
sit or
sure.
stand in front for a while?
In my second year, and I wanted to speak about like a number of things that I've done here. But I thought about the first year of back work thing. In first year, if you don't do back work, you don't get into journal 2, right? And some students, they do back work at Appeal and Press and RMR and Activate. And the reason why is because some students, they come from rural areas. And like in Cape Town, for example, if you come from a township, it's going to take you like 6 rand to get to town, and then from town to Greenpoint, which is going to like cost you 32 rand a day.
Right.
You know, which is like students end up doing their work for 2 days, and then you don't get into Gen 2. And then like not getting into Gen 2 on its own is like very depressing, because you have to appeal and you must write about your situation back at home. And even if you appeal, you're still not sure if they're going to accept you. And that on its own, it depresses a student, because they end up thinking, do I really deserve to be a journalist? Like, how come when I'm at university, I'm being pushed away? So I feel like the journalism department should really change this back work issue, taking what I just said into account, and make RMR and Opila and Press count as back work. You see?
It does actually. So if you can, well, we do. If that doesn't come across to you, then I apologize, because that was supposed to be explained. But the way it's supposed to, sorry, I'm interrupting, but if you spend the equivalent of 40 hours working for Activate, Opera Press or RMR, that's absolutely fine.
But like in your application, like this, they said to us that Opit and it's just part of your portfolio. And that work is compulsory. That's what they tell us.
Unfortunately, a misconception. So yeah, I mean, we recognise the point that you're making. It still disadvantages students in a sense, because obviously it's great to go and do that kind of work in a city or town in South Africa. So we recognise that. I mean, another thing that happened to me this year, a student came up to me and said, "You keep expecting us to produce these civic maps and photographs and put it all on a, you know." I've never worked on a computer before, and I kind of went, and she said, "Well, what do you have to say about that?" I'm quoting you now. I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I absolutely don't have an answer to you, and you're absolutely right." Sorry. There are many things that we don't.
So, like, why isn't like the staff at the journalism department? Because, for example, we as students, we are told that it's compulsory to do IsiXhosa for journalism. Why isn't the staff as well doing IsiXhosa for journalism? Because you get courses like design, which are very practical and technical, and you get students, like you said earlier, who come from Nombulelo High School, who never experienced like working with design, and design is only like 3 weeks with Brian. So why isn't there like extra touch where we students can talk to a lecturer in our home language in IsiXhosa to teach us design? Because there are a few Xhosa speaking lecturers at the journalism, there's probably 2 or 1 at the journalism department. So why isn't it compulsory for you guys as well to learn IsiXhosa and like, yeah.
Good question. I mean, I think a number of Rhodes journalism academics have in fact taken IsiXhosa 1 as a, just voluntarily, but it's a good point. Yeah.
It doesn't only relate to the journalism department. I think it's everybody. So yeah.
And managers will be scared. It's a challenge.
I just want to know, what is in placement?
Well, that's a good question. I think that. Well, I mean, what we're trying to suggest is that by putting themselves in these third places, by putting themselves out there, in social spaces on campus, that they are in placing themselves. They are attempting to locate themselves somewhere. I think emplacement comes from, you know, some of the input that comes obviously from the research that was presented to students, the historical perspective on this place. I mean, it almost, for me, feels like, if you were to imagine, and we talked about the common course and everyone's head, you know, gets raised when we talk about that, but it seems to me that, you know, if you were to think about this, even this little space called campus, like the botanical gardens and what's in there, I mean, there's botany, there's this place through a scientific lens, never mind, you know, there's the geology below our feet. I mean, there's some very interesting geology around it. Yeah, I did some geography and, you know, there's Echo Pass, and there's all sorts of weird stuff around us. Just understanding our place, and in fact, St Andrews, funny enough, and DSG do this. They do this Eastern Cape Odyssey thing. They take learners to walk through the Eastern Cape and discover it historically, you know, I don't know, in terms of geology, botany, zoology, I don't know, whatever discipline you can think of, you could create a lens for emplacement in a sense. Where are we? How do we understand the place that we are? You know, what is this place? Why is it so weird? What can we do about owning its weirdness and beginning to grapple with it, you know, at a deeper level? Because wherever you're in place, and it doesn't mean to say that we're all going to end up staying here and speaking this course for the rest of our lives, but it does mean that that lens, that way of seeing, that hyperlocalism could be transported to wherever we happen to go, you know, in the rest of our lives and careers.
I see you, but I just want to give a few other people a chance before we come back to you.
Well, Maggie and I were actually talking about the boundary of the university just the other day, and I mean, Rhodes, because we work in, Turtle works in most universities in South Africa, one of the things that's so nice about this university is we don't have gates. I mean, many universities in South Africa now, you've got to have a student card to get in and out and what have you. And so we don't have that very physical separation of the campus from the town. But beyond that, we actually have a very obvious separation. So we might not have this. And at what point do we as a university, sorry, I'm really going off topic, but your topic is raised. At what point do we as a university just spill over and far more in the kinds of ways that you're talking about through your project, but also physically, you know?
I don't think it's off topic at all, because it relates to, you know, even some of the things that, yes, that Gladwin was, some of the issues that Gladwin was raising about,
So why do we always happen this side of the arch?
And again, talking about Gladwin's input, I mean, what kinds of students feel more comfortable, you know, in the Jaws of Youth Hub as opposed to others? So when does a student feel empowered? Well, when you actually ask them to do a different kind of task, which is to actually, you know, immerse in and possibly speak a language that 80% of people in this town speak, rather than the language that is being, you know, artificially imposed upon their sources, and so on. So place is really important politically in that sense as well, and it's absolutely a curriculum issue, and it's an assessment issue, and it's, you know, certain students come to the fore and feel, you know, way more. Yeah, I mean, I often, I mean, there are a couple of WSU interns at Grow Cotsmell, and it always strikes me how much better they are at being at Grow Cotsmell than my own students. That's what I was trying to say at the beginning. Our students are, you know, in the sense of the class alienation, it's raced, it's classed, it's, you know, there's thick layers of kind of repellent, you know, against operating in that kind of space. But, as I say, through, you know, displacement and eventual emplacement, those students do actually change. I mean, their perception changes, as you see in the testing.
2 seconds, just quickly adding on that fantastic point that there are no physical gates at this university. But for me, actually, I like to think that's the scariest thing of it all. Because I would say, for example, UJ has a huge gate guarding the entire campus. It's like the Johannesburg Zoo. The gate is massive. But then that gives us a nice explanation for the differences or the spatial discrimination between the University of Johannesburg and the rest of the Joburg community, because there is this big demarcation there showing the distinction between the two spaces. Now, what's scary with Rhodes, on the other hand, is that these are psychological borders now. And then it becomes really, really scary when you think of the internalized inferiority that get to characterize
those demarcations whereby at what level, what does it rather say about our psyche when there are no gates, there are no student number, there's no CPU or anything, but you still cannot walk across because you yourself police yourself that you don't belong here. And that for me is terrifying.
The gates are even internal. So I don't know, that research that was done, the perceptions of Rhodes, people talk about, workers talk about coming through Drosky Arts and coming through the gates of hell. And something that came to my attention recently, I'm going to say this because I'm feeling in a belligerent mood around this. You know, I was recently told that it wasn't possible for Rhodes workers to get access to an email account, EduRoam, access to computer labs en masse. That's just an impossible thing for us to do. And the reason given was by the person I spoke to, who I won't name. He said, well, I don't have a lawnmower in my office. So I don't need a lawnmower in order to do my job. Why would workers need the internet? Why would they need free data on their mobile devices? When all the rest of us get free, by the way, the people with the actual big salaries. So that was the response. So I'm taking this up with the university and I will have this argument out and invite whoever else wants to have this fight. But I mean, I do think that it is, again, it surfaces. That's the internal, you don't just talking about people walking on the campus. The people who are walking amongst us, that's a barrier. That, so for example, there was one of my master's students was doing a workshop with 24 workers who are in a family literacy project. And the idea was to do some computer literacy and media literacy and digital citizenship training with them. And this is where this came up, because we thought that half of them already, see, some of them actually have gone to HR, and they've gotten a piece of paper to say, I am a worker at Rhodes, and then they go to IT, and those few people who have done it actually do get the email address, they do get the EduRoam, and they do get the access to the labs. But we were told that if 1,000 workers did that, that would stop, right? They wouldn't be able to do it for everybody. I was also told that I would have to write a letter for those workers. I would have to write a letter of recommendation that they should get EduRoam. And I said, well, who am I? I mean, what has this got to do with me? Why would I empower a worker to get something that should be a right, okay, to everyone who's employed by the university? They came to the workshop. The workers who supposedly had these login details had forgotten them because they'd never walked into a lab. Imagine workers in overalls, grade 1 to 5, walking into it, exactly, they're pretty comfortable, sit down and access their Facebook account. It just doesn't happen, so they've forgotten. So what did I do? Unfortunately, in plain sight of someone from IT, I logged everyone in using my own login, which is obviously against company policy. So I was reprimanded for this. But these are Rhodes workers getting a workshop inside Rhodes University, and they were unable to do so. And I could have sent them all back to their places of work, but we decided, we made a decision in the moment. But what I'm alluding to is that you're talking about psychological barriers. Those are very definitely and deliberately put in place, actually. I was then told later that ruling that I should write that letter that HR told us, that was made up. That was actually made up to create another level of certainty. The people at IT said there's no such rule. They were simply trying to create another level of barrier against workers getting access to what, in my view, they deserve to have.
Sorry, man, was your point of order? Yeah. Is it covered? Yeah. Okay, Kevin?
Thank you. I just want to say well done for the placement project. I just wanted to tell you that I've been actually interviewed by one of your students who also came and observed one of my classes in Cape Town. And that was very good scholarship. I thought they were quite being empowered by that. And I think it's a very good way of actually transforming the curriculum, the concept of emplacement, and getting students to actually get involved. I think just adding to what Sue has said, I've probably said this observation that Rhodes has an impact that goes further than just South Africa. It's almost international. It actually is international. But when I came here, I felt there was actually no impact in Grahamstown. I couldn't feel it, and I thought a giant, a university of this size, intellectual giant, I know size, maybe quite a dwarf in size, but intellectually quite a giant. And I'm quite pleased to hear such projects, because once students get in there, what they find out then fits into other projects perhaps. I'm just a little concerned that you mentioned the term this emplacement was safely on campus, and I just wonder if the journalism is meant to be a very safe profession, so to speak. I do understand that as a lecturer, to some extent, you are responsible for the safety of your students, but the implications here of safety in places other than the campus, the undertones may be a little uncomfortable. Maybe, I don't know how to deal with it, I don't have any tips, but maybe something to consider to get students to find a way, an indirect way of encouraging them to go elsewhere. Maybe leave their cameras and phones and everything and go to places which are unfamiliar, or take a local, because then the concept of safety is kind of addressed in the future. But I think well done for the attempt, and the first move always has its kind of teething problems, but I'm very sure this project will get better over time.
Gladman, when we need to get back to our student.
Just a quick one. Were there any variations in the experience of students in those places? Maybe by different marks of differences, race, gender, and so forth.
Yeah.
Did you explore that?
Yes. Yes, please do.
I teach an extended studies unit, so some of my students do Rhodes course. So I'm working with a particular subset of that. And I think for a lot of my students, there's not, I mean, they have to figure out what civic mapping is, and 30 places in the day from all this. But I think a lot of them are comfortable with the idea of community media, and I think a lot of them see themselves working in community radio stations and doing that kind of back work, and they're quite happy with it. And, you know, and a lot of them come in saying things like, you know, if I get application forms for people wanting to do journalism, they're often saying, I want to be the voice of the voiceless, and those kinds of things. So I think a lot of times for my students, there's not really a disconnect. They have to get their head around stuff, but I think that's, yeah, I think that is kind of the point, that if they're not uncomfortable with being, yes, exactly. They're not uncomfortable in being with Georgia. They might, you know, one of my seniors said, you know, I get better marks when I go and do stuff in the township, but you know, I've got to find taxi money to get there, you know, so there are kind of practical issues. But they're comfortable in those places, and they're comfortable speaking also you, and so I think in a way that there's not a disconnect for them. So it's speaking to some of the students, and perhaps it's speaking to students that other courses are not as comfortable for, in a way.
I mean, our classes are still overwhelmingly middle class, and I think it is true.
I think some of my students are middle class as well, but even middle class black students or first generation middle class students move backwards and forwards between those kinds of spaces, because graduates and you know, mom and dad live in different kinds of places. So.
I think that idea of social and model space is quite a useful one. There's a theorist called Blankenberg who spoke about that in relation to South African journalism, and wrote a paper about the concept that people were throwing around, which is Ubuntu communitarianism. You know, the idea that journalists should, like, in a sense, think about a different kind of ethics that would come from an African political philosophy, and the only way that, in a sense, you can begin to get a handle on Ubuntu that isn't something that you understand to be part of your cultural heritage, is to put yourself in places where you might discover that and begin to. I mean, I've got quotes here that talk. You know, people say, you know, I had a particular idea about the township, and then I spent 2 or 3 months in the township doing this project. I've got a completely different conception of agency, people's agency, the idea of hopelessness and chaos and poverty and so on. What I see is something completely different. And for him, that was really important. And obviously the other problem, though, is that some students then came up against actually really, really harrowing things. You know, child rape and so on. And they actually wrote very angry blog entries saying, in what part of Rod Amner's brain does he think that this is an educational experience for me? Because I'm actually traumatized, and thanks very much. You know, my year is ruined, and you're responsible for ruining it. So it's very, very difficult. The world is chaotic, but it is also not. You know, it's very hard to chart a course.
So you probably have a few more things on your list that you all need to hear as academics working at Rhodes. So do you want to say some more?
Yes, please. Like with students going to Joza, like what I noticed is that students won't actually, like, even those of us blacks who have money, we won't take out money out of our pocket and take a taxi when there is stuff at the dining halls that we can interview. There's cleaning stuff. So I've noticed that a lot with the journalism students. And what are lectures doing about it? Like, why isn't that our task need actual practical evidence that you really went to Georgia and you didn't just like roam around and ask the stuff here? And another thing, last thing that I wanted to say is about design. Like, radio is technical. We work with a lot of technicalities, editing and all that stuff. And like, you must work with the computer most of the time with radio, which is the same with design. You know, design is very technical. And what I noticed this semester is that we working a lot on print, like a lot of print, like typing articles in first year. In first year we did a lot of articles. Again, now we're doing opinion piece features like we did instead of design, which is a new thing that we haven't been taught in first year. So like, I just want to know, why isn't it a semester course like radio design? Because
well, the second question, I'm not qualified to answer in a sense. I'm not part of the second year print production course, and I don't teach design. But I'd say that what you're raising is important, because if certain students feel a certain kind of barrier to getting into third year design because they don't feel as familiar with it, then I think that's an issue. It should be raised. So I would raise it, you know, with your...
Can we go to the joint curriculum?
Absolutely, yeah. And they're supposed to be, and the Journal department had some interesting meetings with students, and student reps have been meeting with all of the years and trying to get issues raised. So things are moving, I think, in terms of student representation. So I would really encourage you to speak to your class rep and to put this on the agenda and to get it discussed at a second year board level. So there are mechanisms to get these things discussed, and as I say, I really encourage you to do that. The other question is an interesting one. I mean, I think, you know, I would like to move away from the idea of parachute journalism in general. So, you know, it's not just a case of, well, let's do a story in the township. I mean, I think it's about building different relationships to space and place over time. So, for example, as I said, with the Upstart project, they based it at the Georgia Youth Hub. Actually, interestingly, sorry, I'm going to use this platform to be cross about another thing. I mean, one of the things I'm finding frustrating is the Georgia Youth Hub is presented as this, you know, great roads infrastructure that is being put into Georgia. It is not. It's completely dysfunctional. I have never been able to get on the internet there. I have not been able to run workshops in that space. So I end up taking the driving the Upstart kids to Rhodes and illegally logging them on to Rhodes computers because those computers aren't working. The ADC center's just gone down. There was a lightning strike the other day. That lab doesn't work either. So all of this much vaunted Rhodes internet infrastructure in the community, it doesn't work, people. It's just not happening. And you know, EduRoam has gone into the libraries. Only if you're a Rhodes student or a UNISA student or an NMU student can you access that facility. So in fact, no one is benefiting from Rhodes Internet in the wider community. But what I would say is that our students, by partnering with Upstart over time, they are developing relationships with human beings, and those human beings walk with them through their communities, and you know, there's a different kind of relationship that is being struck. So yes, I mean, I don't mind if my students talk to workers on campus, because you're right, they are representative of the communities that they come from. But I think what I'm arguing for is something deeper, less parachutey. It isn't just about doing a one-off story. It's about, and there are plenty of examples, I think, where projects have already done that over terms. You know, building a relationship between one third-year TV student and one upstarter for 3 terms of the year. Those are really, I think, developmental approaches, and it's yielding really interesting fruit. So I think that is transformative in a sense.
Okay. Final question or comment?
Okay, I think it's just a response to how comfortable students are in the community. What we're struggling with in the radio section with the second years is how far do you push the students into the wider community? We have we don't have an exam for the course. It's a radio production course where at the end of the course we're supposed to produce a 10-part radio series. For example, this semester they are producing a series that's supposed to help high school learners apply into university. So all sorts of ideas around what does a gap year mean, how do you actually apply. And most of the sources that came back were DSG, St. Andrews, you know, schools that are this side, schools that are already empowered. And and our course is heavily reliant on tutors. Tutors do the marking, tutors do a lot of support learning. They only meet our lecturer once a week. So when you try to, say, no, they need to go to the community. There are students in Zika, there are students in Samuel Nyaluza that need that information. And we have students who are like, I'm not comfortable, I don't want to go there. And this is a second-year course that's compulsory. When students haven't decided if they want to be journalists, do they want to be design, do they want to do design, which has really nothing to do with interviewing people and being out there in the community. Where do you draw that medium between knowing that they will learn something and it will be a good experience, but as Rod said, you don't want to traumatize people who have really who have been shielded their whole lives. Sometimes you actually, when someone says I'm scared, you believe them. You're like, but some of it really has nothing to do with, it has a lot to do with the way they've been brought up, So for me to say, no, get on a taxi to Joza, that's at Checkers, tell the taxi driver to drop you off at the Joza Youth Hub. You don't know what to do, and we don't get that kind of support, And the tutors bring a lot of their own personal experience, so they can say, when I was in second year, I just got in a taxi and I went. And you really don't want to traumatize someone, and you don't know what role do you play in terms of saying, the series is going to produce no real value if we are teaching, if we are broadcasting to students who know half of the stuff,
Because they have fantastic career counselors.
Yes, and all the sources that come are career counselors from DSG and from St. Andrews, and you feel like, what are we doing,
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this has been such an enormously interesting evening. So I want to say thank you very much to Gladman and Rod for raising issues that we should all be thinking about. And Gladman, I really want to see the next iteration of that research, because it will be so useful for the rest of the Rhodes community. Yeah, thank you so much.